Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Plato's Republic, a book that I think is on every great books list. I don't think there's anyone who ignores Plato's Republic when they begin to tackle the classics. Still, I'm going to tell you a couple reasons why I think it matters so much, and then we can dive right into what I wish I knew before I taught Plato. So, number one, this is the most readable work of philosophy. Spare yourself reading the John Deweys and the Immanuel Kants of the world, who are barely readable anyway, and read someone who can actually write and tell a story, does introduce very complex philosophy that's important for the dialogue about philosophy going forward, but does it in a way that's very readable. You get to read a story with characters and dialogues with Plato's teacher Socrates, and there's angry questioners and deep thoughts about utopia. And that's another reason to read this book. This is probably the first utopian work in history where Plato tries to imagine what the ideal republic would look like. And right along with that, he gets several things so right that as Christians, you're a little flabbergasted by the Republic, and then he turns around and gets things so wrong as well. Hopefully a little bit of that will come out as we talk about this next bit, but it will at least allow you to keep your eyes open for, boy, Plato was really wrong about this, and he was really right about something that moderns don't get right today. Last thing about that, and we'll talk more about this going forward, this is also the best statement, at least in my opinion, of Plato's theory of forms, and that's a real important philosophical concept that we're going to talk about here in a minute. So, what I wish I knew about Plato's Republic. First things first, the translation that we use is by C.D.C. Reeve, and I'm not married to that translation. If you find one that works better for you, feel free. I think the Reeve translation is clear, pays attention to terms, has a nice glossary in the back, but I'm not going to die on that hill that you have to use the Reeve translation. I do think you do need to read all of Plato's Republic. We picked and chose with Aristotle, if you've looked at our Aristotle video, but here I think you and your student just need to commit to reading the whole thing. And going into it, you'll see Socrates is immediately engaged in discussion with an older man about justice. And there's two questions, at least on the surface, that Plato's Republic is concerned with. Number one, what is justice? And number two, and this is just as important to Plato, does it pay? Does it pay to be just? And I don't think anyone who reads this text is persuaded first with Socrates' methodology for discovering what justice is, second for his real conclusion that justice does pay. This is kind of assumed by Plato and all of his contemporaries, that if you lead a righteous life, that life will indeed be good for you. So it's almost something that he takes at face value going into the argument and just tacks on at the end as well. You'll be shocked by how quickly he moves past the Christian definition of justice. There's just one questioner who very quickly says, isn't justice rendering to each his due, basically, which is the biblical conception of justice. And Socrates poo-poos that, moves right past it, and we get a much more convoluted definition of justice going forward. You might be asking yourself, why does he talk about the Republic at all if he's talking about this idea of individual justice? And his argument is, we can see justice better by looking at a bigger thing. When we look at the individual, we can't really see what justice is. So first we're going to consider the ideal state, and then we're going to determine what is just in the state which will then allow us to consider what is just in the individuals. You'll see that he works up a correspondence between things here. So in his state, he has three classes. He doesn't bother to mention the slave class. He has the philosopher king class, the ruler class. He has the soldier class, and then he has the craftsmen and the farmers and pretty much everybody else class. And he assigns gold to the first class, silver to the second class, and then just sort of, stone for the third class. But more importantly than that, he has them correspond to parts of the individual man. So the philosopher kings correspond to the head of the body. The soldiers correspond to the chest, which is where courage lies. And then the craftsmen correspond to the guts, for lack of a better word, all of our animal desires, right? And then he assigns three virtues to those three classes or three parts of the individual man. The philosopher kings and the head are concerned with wisdom. The soldiers and the chest are concerned with courage, and the craftsmen and the guts are concerned with moderation, with being temperate. And you hear all that and you think, great, none of that answers my question about where justice lies. He says that justice lies in the whole doing what it's supposed to do, right? Being actually as it should be. So when the head is wise, when the chest is courageous, and when the guts are moderate, then you in fact get justice within the whole individual. That's his argument for what justice is. You'll see that very clearly as you read along, but it's good to have that in view going forward. Also, and this I think needs to be said very loudly, we are going to meet up with his idea of the theory of forms. And Plato very clearly believes that the way you know things is not from looking around you. When you look around you, you might be able to perceive categories, but you can't really perceive definitions or essences. So this is my own example, and it's not the best, but he would say, if I asked you what a horse is, and you looked at every horse out there, well, some horses are spotted, and some horses have 3 legs, and some horses don't have a tail at all. And so how am I going to be able to define what a horse is just by looking at all these oddball horses that exist in reality? He says what you need to do is intellectually arrive at the idea of the form of a horse, what the ideal horse looks like. And if you're thinking, I don't care that much about horses, he would say it about truth, and he would say it about beauty as well. So don't think that you can discern beauty by looking at a couple beautiful trees and a couple beautiful sunsets. You have to use your mind as a philosopher to think through what ideal beauty is. And it is only the philosophers who can arrive at the forms and actually see what is ideal, which leads us to Plato's cave, probably the most famous part of Plato's Republic, something that you're probably already vaguely familiar with. In Plato's cave, the idea is that everyone is chained in the dark and looking at the wrong thing. Everyone is looking at the wall of the cave and seeing shadows cast on the wall of the cave. But the problem, of course, is those are shadows, not representations of the true ideal of real forms. So what the philosopher has to do is break out of the cave, get into the sun, which actually represents in this analogy the ultimate good, get into the sun and be able to apprehend ideal beauty, ideal truth, ideal justice. So there's this really fascinating moment in Plato, number one, where you recognize he is so right about the existence of absolutes. Most moderns are wrong about this, but Plato looks around, actually Plato uses his reason and says, it turns out that there is an ideal beauty, there is an ideal truth, there is an ideal goodness, and it doesn't matter what one other person thinks about it or feels about it. What matters is perceiving what is actually a fixed absolute, to which Christians say, amen. Amen. I agree with that 100%. Augustine was so shocked by Plato saying this that he thought that Plato had encountered part of the Old Testament when Plato was in Egypt. We don't know the answer to that. It's just speculation. But it is really shocking how strongly Plato comes down on the side of absolutes. He doesn't make the source of absolutes a personal God. That's a massive problem. But his philosophy does carry him a pretty far way. Unfortunately, it also carries him into Gnosticism. And I know you're going to get sick of me talking about Gnosticism, but it's important to say it again. The Gnostic view that the physical world is evil or illusory has nothing to do with Christianity. And the church is colored by that, and we make the mistake all the time of thinking that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad. That is a reductionistic, wrong-headed way of thinking about reality. God made the physical world, and he made it very good. And yes, after the fall, men are sinful, and men have the capacity to abuse physical things, to misuse them, to be intemperate with those physical things. But it doesn't change the fact that the physical is a good gift from God, and that we will have physical bodies in heaven. I'm very quickly going to read a passage from Psalm 104 that really just goes to the heart of this in terms of God's delight in his creation. The psalmist is talking about God, and he says, "He waters the mountains from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied by the fruit of his work. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for man to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread that sustains his heart." You should read all of Psalm 104 as you consider just how good the creation is that our God has made. And please cast aside this idea that we're somehow in a cave looking at shadows, deceived by all of the physical world outside. You know what's outside? A creation that reveals the character of God. Romans 1:20. Look at the trees, look at the lakes, look at the mountains, look at the sunrise, and you will see the nature of the God who made everything. So unfortunately, Plato is colored by Gnosticism. His Gnosticism colors Augustine before Augustine trusts Christ. Well, and even a little bit after Augustine trusts Christ. Unfortunately, that's just there, and Christians have to be on their toes and see it. We don't live in a world of shadows. We don't live in a world where everything physical is evil, and I can count on my body to betray me. Instead, my problem, and your problem too, much more centers around your will, something spiritual, than your body, something physical. Okay, enough about that. I will leave that one alone. I just have to say, too, very quickly, incredibly, Plato ends his Republic with a story, and it's the story of a man who dies and kind of finds out the way things work metaphysically, right? Apparently this one guy dies and goes into the afterlife and is able to see how things work, but come back and tell everybody else. And what Plato does there with that story is reinforces his idea that men need to be just and justice pays, which the Christian says amen to that, of course, but we want to know what justice is. It's not this strange harmonious assembly of man through philosophy. It's in fact rendering to each man his due.